So this is Chris Luquette, a great mandolin player and guitar player in New York. Yeah. So how old were you when you started playing an instrument?
I started playing the guitar when I was about 10 years old, and I'm almost 29 now, so a little bit of time there. Grew up near Seattle, Washington, and there was always a guitar in our house. My mom had a guitar from her days in high school, and it was kind of always in the corner, and my brother would play it here and there, and I would sometimes mess around with it. And then when I started deciding that I wanted to play music, we tried to use that instrument, and went to my first lesson, and it turns out that the guitar had a broken tuner. And so the instructor said it was probably a good idea to invest in a new guitar instead. Like, you could fix the tuner, but it would almost cost as much as a guitar at this point. So my parents said, all right, we'll get you a guitar to try, and if you decide you don't want to do it, it's not a big problem, but we'll see how this goes. And we got another guitar, and that guitar had nylon strings, so for more classical music and stuff. But I got that guitar and just never put it down, and just kept playing. So it's about 10 years old on a nylon string acoustic guitar.
Did you start off with classical guitar?
A little bit. So I was drawn into music via the Beatles, and one of the first instructors that I had would show me a little bit, like some basic chords and things, so I could learn that music. But then he was also a really accomplished classical guitar player, and he started showing me some, basic classical techniques. So it was a little bit of half and half. Mm-hmm. I never really continued studying classical music. I've listened to a fair amount of it, but early on there was some like basic classical training, which is great for technique, great for and on the right hand, before I was using a flat pick, using my fingers, and it was a really great way to kind of be introduced to the guitar.
So how were you introduced to bluegrass?
I had already been playing music for almost 5 years. I started at 10, and around 15, and I had this process where I was listening to everything. So I feel very fortunate when, even being that young, I really wanted to listen to everything. And being drawn into, at a young age, the music of the Beatles, I already had an ear for like classic rock and roll, and would get into that. And then I ended up getting into blues rock, and all these really iconic bands. And of course, being from Seattle, everybody talks about Jimi Hendrix, and so I listened to a lot of rock and roll guitar players and all that. And I ended up one day hanging out with a friend, and a friend of mine who also played the guitar said, hey, have you ever listened to the Grateful Dead? And I said I hadn't, so I got into bluegrass via them, but in a unique way. So a lot of people are familiar with Jerry Garcia played banjo in a band, Old and in the Way, but I didn't find out about that till later.
Yeah.
So I was listening to all the Grateful Dead stuff, everything they ever did, and I really loved that band. But I ended up kind of focusing on a period of theirs where they had some country and folk and bluegrass influenced records that they came out with. And I remember listening to one of the records and hearing this instrument. I was like, oh, what is this instrument? And it was one of the recordings where David Grisman is playing mandolin. And so I went, I want to find out what this mandolin does. And so I ended up getting a cheap mandolin and trying to figure out how to play it to some of those songs. And then found out through some of the recordings and some of the history books and some of the stuff people have written about that band, the bluegrass influence. And I remember reading a paragraph about the band, and they were talking about their folk music and country music influence, and then the influence that bluegrass had on their band. Mm-hmm. And so I just went, bluegrass, what is that? Yeah. So I started researching that, and then I, further along in the biography of this band, they mentioned that they would listen to Bill Monroe records, and that name came up, and I went, oh, okay, bluegrass, Bill Monroe, I got to find out who this is. So I went to the local library, and I got on the computer there, and I just put in like bluegrass Bill Monroe. I didn't even know who that was, you know. And I got really lucky in that they had a couple of albums, couple of CDs, for rent. And I checked out these CDs, and the first one that I listened to, and I'll never forget, is a recording, 1963, live at the Newport Folk Festival. And so, flash forward, at the time I didn't know who these people were, but at the time in that recording, the band is, of course, Bill Monroe, but Del McCoury is playing guitar, and Bill Keith is playing banjo, people that would heavily influence me later on. So I get this recording, and I remember this. I must have been about 15 years old, and I listened to the first 2 tracks. And the first song is Mule Skinner Blues, and the second song is Uncle Pen.
Okay.
And I heard those, and I thought, wow, this is a very specific sound of country music, and it was a little off-putting. Not like I didn't hate it, but I didn't love it right away.
Yeah.
It's very gritty, and it's kind of mean. And I was listening, and the vocals are searing and high and lonesome.
Yeah.
It was unlike anything I'd ever heard, and I was kind of like, okay, I'm a little bit skeptical at this point, but whatever, I'll keep listening. Well, the third track was a banjo featuring Bill Keith, and he played a version of the tune Devil's Dream.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget that it was like this whole aha moment. And it was instrumental, and of course I learned to love the singing and really became enthralled with everything bluegrass. But I remember hearing the searing banjo and just hearing that rapid fire note, and it was like hearing AC/DC for the first time, just like being powerfully moved by this explosion of musicality. And so I decided I really wanted to get into the banjo, and I ended up, because of that recording, I ended up getting a banjo a few weeks later and studying that, and all the while still listening to that one recording from the Newport Folk Festival. And it kind of spiraled from there. I ended up, of course, finding out about Earl Scruggs, and you hear Foggy Mountain Breakdown, and you hear all these things, so I really was like, my ear tuned into that banjo playing. And then I learned to I really just became enthralled with that, and I re-listened to the record, and then I couldn't get enough of it. Everything I wanted to hear was bluegrass, from that point. And so I ended up studying mandolin around this time, banjo at the time, and I was already playing guitar, like I said, for about 5 years. And then I started realizing, the more you find out about bluegrass, and then you discover Tony Rice and Lester Flatt, and you discover all these people, and so then I went back to the guitar, and went, okay, I'll study bluegrass guitar too. So one record, that 1963 Bluegrass Boys, Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys at Newport Folk Festival, I just kind of got lucky by finding that record at my library. And New York City has an interesting relationship with bluegrass.
Yeah.
Me personally,
what drew you to New York City for bluegrass?
Yeah, right. There you go. That's a good question. So there's some personal reasons. There's a lot going on in New York, and it's a good place to be for millions and millions of people.
Yeah.
But New York being such a beacon of music in general, and speaking personally, love bluegrass, and it's one of the things that I do. But I also have a ton of other influence. We were talking about influences, and I listen to almost every style I can get my hands on, and have from the beginning. And so New York has everything.
Yeah.
If you need to hear Mongolian musicians, or you need to hear bluegrass musicians, or country musicians, or jazz, or whatever, and every style of jazz, every style of bluegrass, every style of country music. It's just, this is a place to be, and one of the great spots for that. So that's the thing. Let the door shut here, a little quieter. But yeah, so there was that. There is also a healthy bluegrass scene, as you've been exploring in your interviews, like we're doing now. And it's great. So New York being as big as it is, it draws a lot of people, and some of them are bluegrass musicians. And so for me, it was like, when I'm not on the road, because I tour a lot, it's nice to have access to a lot of stuff, because you don't stop playing music when you get home. It's really hard to avoid, So I get off the road, I come back to New York, and I can go see country musicians, jazz musicians, whatever, and it's a really great spot to be. And it's there's only a very few cities where you can do that, there's LA and there's Nashville, and a lot of American cities have strong scenes, but, this is a very unique one just because of its iconic status, A lot of the stuff I do, there's a lot of East Coast stuff, and so given the choice of East Coast cities, this one was a logical choice. But when I first started exploring the idea of hanging out here more often, I started going to some of the jams. Mona's bluegrass session, I played there last night. I was introduced to that on one of the very first nights I was ever hanging out in New York. I was really impressed that there was this large group of people that knew what bluegrass was, knew all the different sounds and aspects of it. And, I just realized this is a really great place. And then you've got other musicians that, maybe they don't play bluegrass professionally, but they play a little bit, and so they want to come and explore and try new things in bluegrass, and then they go home to their bands and their genres and whatnot, and it's really a great cross-pollination, I was talking to somebody last night about how there's a lot of fiddle players, you know, and certain scenes have certain groups of different types of instruments that show up a lot more. But, you know, New York has a lot of violinists and, you know, things like that, players like that. And it's fun to watch some of the violinists and, you know, either classical or jazz violinists or whatnot come and want to really explore bluegrass and get to know it better and learn. And it's really fun to interact with people like that. And so New York has a giant appeal for that. And historically speaking, New York has always played a large role in the history of bluegrass. And so it's fun to realize that it's not just, you know, bluegrass isn't happening here just because it can, but because it's been a big part of this city for a long time, you know. Which plays into a larger discussion of migration and people, you know, bringing bluegrass with them when they move to big cities like this. So it's really interesting.
How long have you lived in New York?
I have been a full-time, I like to say I've been a full-time part-timer for, I don't know, almost 3 years, maybe 2.5 years or so. I started living in a house maybe 6 months ago, but I was visiting and staying with friends and doing things for a little more than 2 years now, maybe. And I played here, well, I've been playing, so I joined the band that I'm in, Frank Solivan and Dirty Kitchen, in early 2012, and we played Gray Fox that year. And I remember after Gray Fox, I had a few days off, and I was looking for something to do, and I came here and explored. So I've been coming on and off and played a few gigs here and there. So, you know, I was coming to New York City maybe once a year for the last 7-8 years. But then maybe about 2.5, 3 years ago is when I started being here, you know, maybe once a month kind of vibe.
Have you seen the scene here evolve since you've been playing here?
Yes. Not like a lot, but enough, you know, because I leave and come back, and so I see it. I know that in the time that I've been coming here, the banjo player scene has kind of shrunk. When I first got here, there were a few banjo players, and a couple of them moved to Nashville and to North Carolina and such. There's still some great banjo players here, of course. But so I've seen, you know, that kind of happen. And then I also play mandolin and notice that there's a lot of guitar players in town. And so it's been interesting to see that shift. There's been a couple, even in my time, there's been a few gigs that have come and gone. You know, there's a lot of a city this gigantic has a lot of regular gigs and a lot of bars and music places that really want to have music. A couple of those have come and gone already in my time. Of course, there's the bigger picture. You know, I've talked to people that have lived here 20 years, and they're talking about, you know, there's an endless amount of gigs that have come and gone.
Yeah,
but so things like that change. I haven't noticed any trends as far as like sounds or anything evolve, but you know, I haven't had quite enough time to hear that. But you know, in the time that I've been here, I've seen a solid scene, a good core group of people, and they've stayed the same. But yeah, there's definitely some trends, big and small, for sure, like any scene.
Yeah. So you're kind of a part of this, but there are a lot of younger people starting to play bluegrass, or in the scene, especially in New York. Bluegrass is traditionally like a lot of older people are playing it. Why do you think there are so many younger people playing?
Well, that I think we share something in common, which is when I first started playing around 15, 16 years old, I was the only young person in my group of friends, you know. Bluegrass, as far as the larger picture of music, is a pretty small genre. You know, it's popular. It's relatively, it's hard to describe because it's relatively big but relatively small at the same time. You know, so it's gone through some, because it's an older style of folk tradition. You know, it appeals to a certain generation. I think a lot of young musicians kind of, well, if they're like me, you know, you get into it thinking I want to learn to play, and so you kind of, you know, you learn everything you can about all different styles and genres and things. And when you come back to bluegrass, you look to try and apply things you've learned in other genres, and you know, we all come back to it at different times. You know, so it's a very hard thing to predict when young folks will come into it. But you're right, there are large groups of young people coming to it. I think, well, bluegrass has an interesting thing in it, which is a large part of it has improvisation in it. And improvisation and soloing on instruments can be very appealing to young folks. I know when I was, you know, a teenager and listening to rock and roll guitar players and stuff, you know, I was naturally drawn to the guitar solo and to virtuoso instrumentation, you know. And so I think that has an appeal. You know, there's just it feels good when you're playing things and you're exploring, and the ability, there's not a set parameter of, most bluegrass bands aren't reading music, we get up there and play and know some of the chords and the songs, and we're free to solo over them.
Yeah.
And that's a very appealing thing to young musicians when they get kind of are drawn to improvisation early on, which is good. There is an inner battle, of course, within the genre of, well, how can we keep it sounding like the old style while still progressing into a new form, and things. And that struggle will never end. I notice some of the younger generation, myself included, are pretty cool with the idea of, gosh, we really love playing old style and playing Bill Monroe songs and stuff, and I love that. And then I also want to have an outlet where I can play whatever. And if I want to play, reggae music on acoustic instruments, we want to be able to do that too. So I think, generally speaking, I noticed that some of the festivals that I play at, when they're billed to be more just traditional, we're going to have all bands that sound a certain way and look a certain way. The crowd tends to skew a little older, whereas you go to a festival, maybe like a Del Fest or a Gray Fox or Rocky Grass or something, where they kind of say, okay, we're going to have a lot of bluegrass acts, but we're also going to open the gates to other genres and things. And then those bands bring their fans, and some of them are young bands with younger folks and, mixed generations and whatnot, which is really good. And then you see a little bit more diverse crowd. So, there's no one right way to do things, but I think bluegrass in general it's a very honest form of music too. It's just mostly acoustic instruments and whatnot. So what you play is what you hear, and I think that appeals to a lot of young musicians. And I also know some of my friends that are really great players did come up and play rock and roll or metal guitar or whatever, and then they kind of circle back to bluegrass as it's trying to find a new sound and a little bit, maybe not more honest sound, but it's fun to play acoustic and to get these ideas across on that.
Yeah. So I'm really sorry about this next question, but if you could describe bluegrass, like the music or the scene, in one word, what would it be?
Exciting.
That's a good one.
Yeah. I don't know. Bluegrass is, well, it's exciting to me. That's the first thing that comes to mind is, you've got all these stories when people talk, like, when they think about the impact that Earl Scruggs had on joining Bill Monroe's band and hitting the stage at the Grand Ole Opry in 1946, and the audience and all the people on the radio just being blown away by what they were hearing. And then for me too, there's even earlier, 1939, there's the recording Bill Monroe's playing guitar, and they do Mule Skinner Blues. And just from the first bunch of notes as kind of the introduction to the world of, here's our version, this style of music, which isn't even called bluegrass until later. But here it is, and people just, being blown away by it, and early country musicians just, just lightning bolts coming out of the radio. And I've heard a lot of people, like another second or third generation bluegrass musicians talking about the first time they heard Bill Monroe and Earl Scruggs and Flatt and Scruggs and the Stanley Brothers and all these vintage acts, vintage now, but at the time, just red hot. And I remember a lot of people just feeling a general sense of excitement, which is the same as I felt. So I heard that, Bill Monroe recording with Del McCoury and the band, and that was the Newport Folk Festival album, and I heard that, and it got me into it, and the first thing I wanted to do was, how do I hear this in person?
Yeah.
And I got very lucky, made a friend at a bluegrass jam that I went to, and he said, well, you're going to go to Wintergrass, of course, and I didn't even know what that was at the time. Well, Wintergrass is a gigantic festival, indoor bluegrass festival near Seattle, and I'd never even been to a bluegrass. I didn't even know these existed. You go to a festival, and just the general level of excitement is just so present. It's another thing that draws in young people too. Is just everybody's excited to be there, to share music and share ideas. So yeah, one word: excitement, I think.
Do you have any standout moments playing?
Yeah. The one that comes to mind, of course, is the first and only time that I've ever played Telluride Bluegrass Festival, which is, you get into this genre and you start playing in a touring band, and there's a endless list of gigs that you would like to play, mostly just because you want to be able to share your music with these audiences.
Yeah.
I was in Dirty Kitchen for about 2 years, and we just got a call from Planet Bluegrass, which is the organization that books Telluride, and they have a slot they would like us to fill. Let's make it happen. and we ended up making it happen. And there was a general excitement, there's that word again, in the band, and this was maybe, we had about 3 months ahead of time that we knew we were going to do this. And we prepared for it and played, got ready for it. And then, but that moment where you walk out on stage and they introduce the band and you start playing your first song, and like I remember kind of looking at the band, looking at the guitar, and then looking up and just seeing the audience, seeing the hills, and just knowing where we were, and that's kind of memorable.
Yeah, definitely.
That's memorable. And then also maybe the first time playing Gray Fox too, because I had been on the West Coast playing bluegrass for 4 or 5 years, and had always heard about Gray Fox on the East Coast as being such an elite festival like Telluride is. And then being there for the first time, which was 2012, I remember being on that stage, and looking out at the farm and seeing all the folks there. And of course, I've only experienced the what people still refer to as the new location.
Yeah.
I think it's Walsh Farms.
Yes, it is.
So I'm only familiar with that, but I understand that there's some history at several other locations, but to me, even it's no matter where that festival goes, as long as it's branded Gray Fox and known, run by those folks, the organization, that's a special place to be,
Yeah, I wanted to know who I would have seen at my first Gray Fox, and so I looked up who was the lineup that year, and it turns out that I saw Earl Scruggs.
Nice.
The last Gray Fox he played.
Nice.
In 2004.
Sweet. Yeah, these festivals attract the best performers and the best musicians and the best people, and it's so great. But these festivals are such a great community. That's another huge part of this music, is to have these gatherings.
Yeah. So how did you start playing with Frank Solivan in Dirty Kitchen?
I went to my first Wintergrass maybe 2006, which is that festival near Seattle, and immediately knew I had to go every year. So I did go every year. I think I went to 11 of them in a row before I wasn't able to make it. And in 2010, I think it was, so Wintergrass is late February. So February 2010, I was there, and I was talking to a friend of mine who knew, I didn't know Frank Solivan at the time, but there was a mutual friend of both of ours, and so those two were talking, and I went up to say hello to my friend, and they said, "Oh, Chris, have you met Frank?" And, "Oh, no, I haven't yet." So I met him briefly, and I remember seeing him around, but he wasn't playing there. He was there to visit his dad, so he was kind of there on a little family reunion trip. And so I remember seeing him around, but another year went by, and Wintergrass 2011, he was there, and I remember, "Hey, I think we met last year." Yeah. Well, we started playing and jamming. And it was clear that we were having a lot of fun together, and playing, and I saw him around, and I just loved the way he sang and the way he played, and I just knew that, this is somebody, and, I was about 21 years old, and I was looking, at such an impressionable, was seeking out people that I knew could help me play better and, learn from, and so we sat at a bunch of jams and would play. And we kept in contact, and he had already started Dirty Kitchen by that point, and I remember they had their first record, and he gave me a copy at this festival, and I remember listening to that first Dirty Kitchen album, and Lincoln Myers played guitar, and Stephen Custodi was on the bass at the time, and Mike Munford, who's still in the band, played banjo, and I remember hearing that album and just being blown away by every note of it, and just immediately that band became one of my favorite bands. And so we kept in touch, and then that year I went to probably my second or third IBMA, and it was still in Nashville at the time, and so I was there, and Frank was there, and we started jamming again, just like we had, and they were transitioning to a new bass player, and so the thought was in my head was that, well, I don't play bass, but maybe I should learn how to play bass in case they need somebody, because I really wanted to play in that band, because I just loved how they played. I could sense that Dirty Kitchen had the ability to play the best bluegrass, traditional sounding bluegrass possible, but I could also tell that they played, I could hear them experimenting with other sounds and other songs and kind of a newgrass kind of vibe to it, and really, could jam, and had some cool solos and stuff, and so I could sense they were kind of a great hybrid band, so I kind of followed them around and wanted to hear them and whatnot, and I was a fan of the band, Well, another, 6 or 7 months went by, and I got a call And Frank said, hey, we have a tour in Alaska and our guitar player's leaving the band. We need a fill-in. Would you be willing to learn this music and come fill in?
Mm-hmm.
So I said, without even thinking about it, I said, oh yeah, of course.
Yeah.
So I spent about a month learning. I'd already heard these songs 1,000 times, but I started learning all the guitar parts. And January of 2012, they had a 2-week tour booked in Alaska. Our first gig was in Fairbanks, Alaska, which is like center, way up there. And it was 40 degrees below zero the night of our first gig. Yeah, that was nice and cool. And luckily the gig was indoors though, so everything was good.
That's good.
And we played this gig, and I remember just being so excited to do it. And the bass player that they had hired, that Frank had just hired, was a man named Danny Booth, a dear friend of mine. And Danny was an Alaska native, so he had lived in Alaska, and he was living in, I think, Colorado at this point once he had joined Dirty Kitchen. But so it was kind of a big family reunion up there, and Frank has lived in Alaska, and so we went, like, this first tour, I'm there, and I'm meeting all these people, so-and-so, and all these dear friends of the band and friends that I have now.
Yeah.
That was just such a great, we went on a 2-week tour. At the end of the tour, Frank said, hey, if you want this job, you probably end up hanging out on the East Coast, and we'll be touring a fair amount and playing, and you want to join the band? And again, it took me less than 10 minutes to mull it over, and I said yes, and here we are almost 8 years later. It's been a great band to be a part of, and things have evolved in the band over time, and we've got a new bass player now. His name's Jeremy Middleton. He's playing mostly electric bass now, and love him. And I've been in the band almost 8 years, and still having a good time.
So we were just at Delfest, and you played a lot of other festivals. But how do you think the festivals affect like the progression of bluegrass and how bluegrass carries on?
Yeah, well, so one of the things about bluegrass is that it's usually acoustic, so acoustic guitars, mandolins, banjos, upright bass, And so when you don't have to have the burden of carrying around a bunch of electronic gear, the freedom becomes that you can jam anywhere you want.
Yeah.
And jamming is such a huge part of bluegrass. It's one of the things that that drew me in too. So you have this ability to be at home on your own time, practicing a bunch of things, and then you can go the next night to a jam and try those things out. You don't have to wait till band practice or tour or whatever. You can just do it. Which is why you see bluegrass jams at festivals and coffee shops and bars and parks and and everywhere. You can have one. Because all I need is my guitar and a pick, and I can just start playing, and so that's great. So bluegrass festivals, sometimes you'll see some of them will go away, but generally speaking, more often than not, so many festivals just keep growing and growing and growing. And you talked about Delfest, they just keep getting bigger and bigger, more powerful, and better bands and better vibe. It's amazing to see it grow. And the anticipation is always there. You see people like they're just getting there, and I can't wait for next year. Like, oh my gosh, we were talking about excitement. Everybody's just so jazzed for it. So, the Bluegrass Festival is a huge part of the music. In fact, we were talking about a poster that's behind the camera here, which I have. It's just a recreation of the very first Bluegrass Festival run by Carlton Haney. And it's like the presentation of it, to be able to go to one spot and see all these bands and to be inspired, and then immediately like see a band. I remember going to, when I went to my first few Wintergrasses or other summer festivals, the idea to go see a band, be so jazzed and so excited that you just heard them, and like, I got to go play now. You run to the campsite and just start playing. It's a very unique thing. So how that evolves, I don't have a better way to put it. But it keeps attracting people that want to play and share music and share stories and share songs, and that's good. That's a really good thing.
Well, thank you so much for talking.
Hey, it was a total honor, total blast.